Hi.
Hi.
Hey guys.
Hi, Rob.
Hi.
All right, should we get started?
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, so past couple of weeks, we've been, I think, kicking around a few different ideas to address the concerns that Matt raised in that working group meeting. I think it was a little over a month ago. So I can catch you up on those, and yeah, and you can let us know what you think, and I guess just hoping that there's a way that we can get unblocked and find a way to move forward. Yeah, so we had most like this original gist with the results here, and Matt, you had posted something like I think the idea was basically like changing like the IDs to not really refer to the fragments anymore, but instead like different points in the data and a way to follow the tree through to get to them.
Yeah.
So my question on that was like, if we're moving the IDs to the individual payload, do we still have a way to track when a whole fragment has been delivered, so you know that it's okay to render it? And so I think Yakov iterated on that a little bit. I think this might be a bit outdated from what you had, but the idea was kind of, you have like two separate IDs, one for the individual pieces of data and another one to track the whole fragments. I had a proposal where I was just kicking around, like, would it be better if we kept the IDs for tracking deferred fragments and when they're completed, but instead basically keep everything the same, but only change pending into some kind of tree structure, so that you could traverse both the data and pending at the same time. I think that so this doesn't, you don't have to deal with any issues of mixing data and metadata into the same object. I will admit that this like array tree syntax is a bit clumsy. We had a few different ideas of different ways to do that. We might get slightly larger payloads under incremental because we want to track multiple IDs on each one and have the whole path. So because when you had one ID, we could use that path as like the subpath of it, but with multiple IDs, we just have to have like the whole path for each one. Yeah, and here's an example where in an incremental payload, that's where you have another defer. So you will have so new pendings would be introduced at the same level of the incremental object. And stream is, yeah, and here's just an example to show that you could do the same thing with stream. Another idea of how to like represent that structure maybe is a little bit slightly more verbose, a little bit less clumsy, is just kind of like have this format of basically like still using objects, but nest everything on one level. So, you know, you can tell the difference between like where the pendings are and where the and what fields are correspond to what's in the data. So I think that's where we're at right now. And Matt, you had messaged me like a few things about stuff you were looking at Facebook. I don't know if you want to go over that with everyone, or
yeah, the things that I'm most worried about actually having like looked at Facebook usage of defer and really digging in a little bit is one, the things people like, how big of a foot gun are we giving defer? It turns out like a lot of people, it seems like, experiment with defer and then don't use it, and it feels like the reason for that is that they can't understand why it explodes their response size, right? Because if you are iterating on some component deep in the tree and you add a defer there, and it happens to be one element in a 100-element list, and there's a defer above you, like this is the entire reason why we have like the deduplication of responses and all, like, and I don't know if there's actually a way to resolve, even if you can deliver all of that data in the same payload, resolving the fact that a defer's response size and network cost ends up exploding. And that is worrying to me. It's especially worrying given we are solidifying a spec response format as opposed to a like, given this happens, this is the behavior that is expected. This is what needs to be accessible when. But yeah, so that's kind of like my current, just like, this is why defer is hard take. Not as a like discouraging thing, but as a the recommendation for how to use defer and when, and like there is a cost, and we may I may not have internalized that cost until recently.
So you're just to clarify, Matt, you're talking about the existing, like in the wild version of defer at the moment that doesn't have any of the deduplication.
Correct, but it really, deduplication isn't going to help when, so the thing that got me worried was actually we have defer at Facebook for that you have the option of turning it off. We have like this flag that you can pass that if it's false, then return all of it in one payload, but you still need to annotate that this defer was fulfilled. And we have some responses where that is defer fulfilled for this specific label in this specific path, where we get like a few hundred, maybe 1,000 of those. And that, like, yes, it's on an already large payload, so maybe it just doesn't matter. But the fact that we're getting like hundreds of paths added outside of the tree in order to tell the client, yes, you did not, in fact, we did not defer this. Like, it all comes back in one payload, but the total payload cost went up probably like, I don't know the exact number, but it was probably like a 10 to 15% payload cost up. And that's with like 2 defers explicitly listed in the query.
So our version, we're saying that we're allowing servers to inline defer, meaning it's treated the same way as if like if was false, and comes back in the same payload, and we do not need to send any metadata to say that, so the clients understand that happening. It's only that I feel like the difference between what you guys have is that because you don't have like this pending, I don't think you do.
No.
That means that you have to do the opposite and say this wasn't deferred. Whereas when we pending, it's only sent when something is deferred. So like the lack of that being sent would be enough for clients to know that the defer was ignored or inlined. That's kind of how like we got to adding this pending thing. So I think that means like the cost of deferring something is a bit higher, but like the cost of the server ignoring it is lower.
Yeah. Do we need, yes, that's true. And I think that that's probably the right trade-off. So I guess talking through it, that is actually a good, like a good choice for where we are versus where the initial Facebook defer.
But with the cost is a bit higher, Rob, you mean that we have this extra pending metadata, right?
Right, yeah.
But that's I think when correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, is the exploding cost tile is because of the data that is deduplicated now in Facebook, or when you defer something, or
we don't deduplicate anything.
because we duplicate.
But it's not the duplication, because the things that are being deferred are in fact on separate paths.
Okay.
So
But
that's not, it's that, yeah, I don't have a good example, but it's really the defer inside list, possibly inside list. It's the same like defer explosion that I think Yakov was really like working through a few times, and yeah.
Yeah, without the deduplication, a big risk is not necessarily defers inside of lists, but defers with overlapping fields. And so I think that is solved.
Yeah.
In a good way for this proposal, at least, where that's not going to be happening because we're only sending fields once. Yeah, I think like lists inside of lists, that I don't have good ideas of how to get around that, other than some kind of like server validation where it's like at a certain point. I think that there should, like, in this, even like the most simplest case, a server should have some kind of limit, like where I already deferred 20 things, I'm not going to defer anything else. I don't care. Like, I probably didn't defer the things that would have been most optimal to defer, but
that's really server implementation detail, and we allow that with the spec, right?
Yeah.
And that we maybe should, like, there should be a note that servers should ensure such behavior and think about that. But then
the other thing is there might be a way to, like, it might be the case that the compiler something should in fact hoist a defer in, like, if you have a defer inside of a list, instead have.
У мене дзвінок там по роботі. Якщо треба буде вас випустити,
Ivan,
вам, подзвоніть.
I can mute him.
Давайте запишіть мій номер телефона. Щоб...
А ви тут з вікна не побачите?
No.
But yeah, basically there might be a way to hoist up the defer inside of the list, in which, like, make basically a sibling path in your request with a defer at the top for the items that you are actually deferring, so that you basically get a single deferred payload for all of the deferred list items, rather than, but that's like that's more getting into the, like, how we recommend you use defer, as opposed to like necessarily the spec implementation.
Yeah, I don't think the server should like silently like move defers around or anything, because
the client compiler could do that, like relay.
Yeah,
they could have things like that, but
or a validation, a like optional validation rule of like hoist your list your defers inside of list to like sibling paths with a defer at the top of the path.
One other thing that I think differs from the Facebook implementation is, I mean, we've essentially wrapped payloads inside of an array, and that means that we can be resolving several defers at the same time in one payload. So I think there's also things that servers can do, like debouncing these in a way so that sending a larger payload with a lot of things. And now, like, it does mean that there's going to be cases of a lot of like repeated paths in the response, but it should mean that like it's not causing like a client re-render for everyone
Yeah,
for every.
right. Yeah, and it
And
might
also,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Benji.
sorry, Matt. Most of those things are also like temporary, right? We shouldn't need them at the end. They're just there in the interim.
Yeah.
You mean it's just like metadata for the client to figure out where the data goes, and it's not. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So
temporary.
what Matt was saying before with the Facebook version where it does the actual it turns off the defer but still gives you the metadata. There was still that metadata, I imagine, at the end in like the resolved object telling you these things are now done or whatever. Is that accurate, Matt?
No, we do throw it away because we end up internally having a client side field that has like is defer fulfilled. That's how our client works. And so the metadata basically causes that is defer field to be set to true, and then they're thrown away. So they're only used like as soon as we get them.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, it's really the network cost that is the parsing cost, even the server calculation and creation cost, I don't think are really that high. It's really the network. But this would be a great like example if we have like use cases where we can show, hey, we did defer in an expensive way, and say gzip just like the way that we have it formatted, gzip eats it up and it's only a 0.5% increase in actual network bytes or whatever. Like that would be pretty compelling.
Certainly the highlighted part on the screen at the moment does look like it would compress incredibly well with gzip.
Yeah, right. And it's basically proving that would be like a good thing for the basically for being able to just respond to naysayers like me.
So Matt, have you wrote up that original like rough idea, I guess just over a month ago. Have you done like a tidied up version of that at all?
No, I have not. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Just because I've been away a little bit.
Okay, so do you think that like so I definitely think we need like guidelines in the spec recommending, like you need to understand that like there is a cost for defer. That's always been the case in my opinion. Spec should definitely call that out. Client side compilers can do things maybe to make things more optimal. I think server implementations can be smarter about the way that they batch groups into incremental
Execution. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's not required that every defer has its own like payload that parses. Like we built this incremental as an array, and all of the stuff completed as an array, so we could put a lot of stuff in here. And we're definitely telling clients like read all the stuff out of incremental before you re-render. That's a requirement. So do you think is there other stuff that you think we need to explore to address the concerns of payload explosion?
I don't, nothing pops up as like the obvious next thing. Which isn't helpful, I know.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I think that some part of it is that I mean, like Benji has been like pushing these issues a lot, and so I think you are catching up a little bit, and like it wasn't that long ago that our version was like very close to what the Facebook one is, but it's changed like quite a bit over the past several months. Okay, so the next thing was Yakov, why don't you go ahead?
Well, this might relate to why don't you go ahead actually, because it might relate better to what you're.
Yeah, I was just gonna say if we can dig in some more to the actual specific shape and how we can make it easier for clients to parse. Was that what you were going with too, or?
Well, so they're kind of two, like I was saying at the end of the last week, there's kind of like two issues I think that Matt raised, and obviously since I'm paraphrasing you know, feel free to, you know, edit, but as I saw it, there was one about immutability, and one about presenting the incremental data as, you know, pending or completed in ways that are easier for the client to parse. For example, like using a tree-like structure. So putting aside that, you know, how to present it a little bit, you know, just for a second, in terms of immutability, I'm starting to see that there may, or think that there may be maybe more, you know, starting to agree with the perspective that we need to make it easier for clients to generate immutable payloads. And my issue is mostly actually not around defer, but around stream. Meaning when we have defer, even though we're changing an object, by adding fields, we never actually change an existing entry. But with stream, actually, on the other hand, we do change what's in that final reconcilable object, because we change like the length of a list. And that could, I mean, the clients could you know, so therefore get lists with, you know, sort of unstable lengths. And I guess they get objects with unstable number of properties, but that doesn't seem like as much of a concern. But certainly, like, I could see, like, you know, if you render something that has a certain number of items, and then all of a sudden it has more, I could see that could you know, sort of unpredictably, because you're reading from that reconcilable object, I could see that would lead to problems. And I'm not actually sure that the response changes in the response format, though, that we're envisioning, you know, in on like some of the comments on that, the gist, I'm not sure that actually, like, I feel like that's a real concern, but I'm not necessarily quite solidified how a client might manage it. You know, I'm not, you know, they wouldn't necessarily, there it's more about stream than about defer, so it's not really about necessarily including in a completed result, you know, the full list of payloads, as opposed to referring to the initial reconcilable object. Although I think, so I think I have to work through that a little bit more in my head, but I am definitely seeing that there could be a mutability concern. So I'm wondering what you guys, smarter folks, have to, you know, think about that.
But it can only get longer, right? Cannot get shorter. And at the moment, it's like we're not inserting at the top. I mean, we talked about that there could be other ways to patch in the future, but at the moment, it's basically we append. And that is still very simple to handle, if you will.
Yeah, the case where I don't know, like there could be the case where the whole underlying iterator errors before the whole list is delivered, or before you know that the whole list was delivered. I still don't think that clients are going to want to like remove things that were already rendered. But I guess that's like a different piece of metadata that you probably want to handle in your client. Like you need to know like there's some things here, but this is not necessarily the whole list because there was an error. And that's different than like an individual item erroring out.
I mean, from a building a client perspective, stream, like we already sort of do this internally, but the way I would do stream is basically it becomes that element internally becomes a list of lists. Right. And so, yes, I'm appending to the larger list, or it's like it's a, you know, objective lists or whatever with like I index ordered, so I know, okay, the first thing, whatever. But basically so that I don't need to mutate the objects as we get them off of the response. And we are able to, for instance, right, if there's an error at the end, we can show something different than if there's a like pending versus if there's if the whole thing is completed. But
I mean, yes,
I think though this is hitting Yakov to a issue we have with the current proposal, which is basically we don't really have canonical like, and this is a example showcasing its usage, right? We have like, oh, theoretically, this is a query and this is what we expect of the response, but not like, this is how you can tie it all together. This is a small app or whatever that showcases why it is valuable and where there are foot guns. Right. Because it's really hard to reason through whether mutability on the client matters and how it matters without having like a worked through example of like how difficult it is requiring mutability versus having immutable structures.
We have like working demos of defer and stream. I know like Michael has a bunch that he showed like at our like we did the presentation last year. I know he like
Sure.
Do you mean like publishing stuff like that?
Oh, I wasn't, I may have just forgotten about those. But basically for our newest formats, do we have like do we have those built into the end-to-end demos?
So if we are like I waited to update our implementation that we have, but if we are more in a more stable phase, then I will go ahead and implement that. I mean, it will take a week or so, but
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot.
but at the moment it was like so fluctuating that I stopped updating my demos.
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Like we're not sure if this is the direction we want to go in. So
yeah, but it was at some phases we had like 5 proposals or so, and also they were very different in parts that it became too much. If we think that is a good thing that we want to try out, I will go ahead and implement it over the weekend.
what client were you using in those demos? Were you using Relay or were you're using your own?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a Relay implementation for it. So basically it's just the network layer and you in the network function, you just implement the patching. We have it implemented for the last thing we did for several versions, even in the same network layer. So yeah, I can also provide the code and stuff.
I think because I think that getting relay working with this version is going to be hard because it's changed quite a bit from what relay expects. It used
yeah,
to
but in
be able to
relay,
do some.
So what we did also with the last one, we transform it into the patches that we can provide to relay. You could do the same thing with that. It's a bit more aggregation stuff that you have to do, but it also, when we went out from the first version to the later versions that we had, it was already where we had to aggregate stuff with the incrementals, and
Right.
it's a bit more work, but it still should be possible.
And you said you also have your own client?
Yeah, we have the graphical IDE that we have, and then you can also see all the patches. We actually have a patch analyzer, so you can, like, if you go on the request, you can expand it. Then you have a tree with all the patches that are applied and things like that. So I can start implementing that if we think it's something we can rally at the moment behind. I don't mind if I have to redo it, but it's like when we have still like 5 different versions, then it's a lot to update.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
So another thing that talking through this, so one, I think that Michael's, yeah, we should not ask him to implement 5 different versions just to see what feels a little bit better. But another thing here is, if we establish pretty strongly, like, you do not want defer explosion, and so there should not be 1,000 defers. Like, if on average there's going to be 1 to 10 defers, it doesn't actually matter if the pending is in a list versus a tree. And this is something that I'm like just working through right now mentally. So because, like, yes, you have to iterate over every element in that pending and completed list. But if that completed list is like 10 items, the iteration doesn't actually, like, the iteration to find the exact item doesn't actually matter.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you guys can see. This is basically what we do. Here's a query, and you have here, for instance, the result, and then you can also see here the patches, and also go through each of the patches that you get, right? That's what we did also with the last thing.
Yeah.
So that's from the graphical IDE stuff, but like, to update this is always a bit of work.
Yeah, but basically my points about, like, my proposed tree structure, like, yeah, that might be way overkill in a world where we only expect, like, if you're getting more than 10 incremental payloads, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah. I'm not sure where the number is going to land at, but I definitely, it feels like it should definitely be less than 100, definitely less than 50.
Yeah, man, you remember my demo when I
yeah, exactly.
a couple of things, and then you had the 3,000, and then it's like, okay, now we I actually made it worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also in that, and like, but that's a good, like, back then we were like, oh, server shouldn't change that. Now we are more like, a server can change that, and even should, like, if it's going too much into too many patches, and with that we can make it much more efficient. Like,
Yeah, and if the list pending and incremental responses makes it so that it's easier for the server to cut off and, like, not over defer, or over
Yeah.
incremental. That's actually probably preferred to having like the format be in a structure that the client can easily patch in.
Yeah.
Okay, so you think that we're okay with moving forward with what's in the gist, assuming that we're making it very clear. Like Benji wrote this comment in the chat that defer is a trade-off. It enables you to deliver critical data to users with lower latency at the cost of slightly higher network traffic and slightly delayed request completion. We want to be clear,
Yeah.
defer is not a magic bullet. Just like adding defers isn't like a shortcut to just making everything faster. Like, there's cost there. The servers I think we had said before, we want to recommend to servers like to it's fine to ignore the defers for performance reasons. Probably even by default, we should have some kind of hard limit that where maybe you're trying to be malicious by just having like millions of defers in a query. Maybe not, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we should have like a strong note there, so that also implementers are
Right.
aware of that. This could, if not implemented with limitations, could even lead to your server being attacked with that.
Okay, so all of these other comments that we had with different ideas, I feel, and the ones that I showed in here, trying to get pending into a list. I feel like they all of them like hamper readability of the response in some way. So I think we should abandon it if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I think it was the right thing to walk through what it could look like in all the iterations there. But because like it is a question, and now we have all these examples of like, well, we could do it. Here's kind of what it looks like. Kind of doesn't feel clean compared to the list. And if we're only getting 10 items back, like, is it worth all of this?
It's more optimizing for the cases that we don't really want to happen anyway.
Exactly. And so it's actually possibly a good thing, because if your response looks really ugly and unreadable, it actually is likely you're doing something ugly and unreadable.
Yeah.
So Matt, you had raised issues with the response shape, but also with immutability. Do you think that the immutability issue is no longer a concern?
So my issue with the immutability is like, we have all the data where we could do things immutably, right? We could just store the payload and walk through it for the like client right now. It's just the access and like the lookup mechanisms are big O on the length of the pending and completed arrays, right? So anytime you hit a potentially deferred field, you have to like look through those payloads and make sure that that one is not present or is present, therefore where to look for it in the next incrementals. And you have to look for each incremental, you have to go through and look through the whole thing, which matters if we're going to have 1,000 items in the incremental, but because then you're going to 1,000 times you have to look through these 1,000 elements in the array. But if it's like you're going to end up, we're going to try to keep the incremental payload down below 10, that feels a lot less of a problem, and in fact might be simpler than traversing a tree. So it's like the issue with mutability is more like, can you how complex and how much processing power is going to be necessary to keep the data structures just like immutable as they came off of the, or somewhat similar as what they came off of the response format. And how costly is that for the client when it's in its render phase, if it's reading through the purely immutable response format? And I think that like my understanding of the resolution there is like, if there's one element in the incremental payload and there's one item that you've deferred, there's no cost, essentially. Cost is super low.
Yeah, okay. I get you. Thanks.
I wanted to call this out. Yakov, you just wrote like, we have to make clients aware that even on the same field, defers might start to be inlined. And Benji replied, but yeah, I think that that's fine for the spec. We're allowing defers to be inlined, even if it's in a list of like 20 items, there's a defer in each one. You could defer the first one and none of the other ones, or you could defer every other one or something like that. And because the pending that we're sending has like the array element in it, that should be fine for clients to understand, right?
If you allow that, I mean, that works. I'm just reading through Benji's reply.
Because if there's a defer inside of each list item, we would send a pending for each of those list items. So if you're not sending a pending for one of the list items, then the client can assume that that one was inlined. And so that's fine for the server to do.
Yeah, sounds good.
I should
Okay.
I should point out that one of the trade-offs of doing this, of allowing the server to choose to inline some things but not others, is that it does compromise the predictability of the shape of those response payloads. So it's easy, I think, in my opinion, to just say ignore them all, because then you just know it's going to be that final, as if there were no defers and no streams. That's easy. Deferring and streaming everything that is specified is also straightforward and gives you these predictable payloads. But if we do allow the server to choose to inline things, and especially, as Yakov says, if we allow them to inline, like, you know, the first 20 times an item is deferred, but then not the final, you know, 50 or whatever, then those response payloads are going to be of different forms. And if we allow for all of that, a client that needs to account for that would have like a combinatorics problem of trying to build up all the possible payload shapes. Now, if we don't care about the payload shapes being predictable, then that's not a big deal. But it is something that we did talk about, and I'm not sure how much of a concern having those predictable payload shapes is. I just wanted to raise it as something to think about.
But that's why we introduced pending, no?
Yeah, that's why we have like this possible incremental payload shapes should be predictable, and why I put it as a question mark. But yeah, I think it should just be a no, if because we're also allowing server inlining.
So I think before we concretely decide on allowing server inlining, we should actually weigh up what the actual what the costs are, because it would be a lot simpler to specify that either everything is inlined or nothing is, rather than having to specify what happens if you choose to inline or not inline at each point. You've got like branching in the spec code, then you've got branching in all the implementation code, and you've then got all the clients having to deal potentially with the fact that this happens. Now, as I was saying to Yakov in the chat, there's clients like Apollo client, or at least what a client Apollo client used to be. I'm not sure of the specific details anymore, but it used to not care what the request was at all. It only cared about the data that it was reading off the network. So long as the data is sufficiently descriptive, it wasn't going to be an issue. But for a client that does understand its request and then tries to synchronize its request with the response from the server, it may be more of an issue. And especially for strongly typed clients that are expecting payloads to be of very specific shapes with keys in very specific orders that can work really well with very specific JSON parsers or whatever coming off of the network, it may be more of a concern.
Why I think that the inlining is important is I feel like a server maybe just wants like a simple cutoff that says I'm not going to defer more than 20 things in the request, and you're not going to know, like there is a defer on a list and you don't know how many list items there are until you've already started executing them, and maybe you sent some defers already, so you can't decide when you're in the validation stage to reject the whole thing or not do any defers.
Yeah, I'm also and I mean, I was from the beginning, from the server has control over this and we can essentially inline certain defers, because we could also decide you're deferring their stuff that we anyway have in the first instance, so we just inline that because it makes no sense that you do a defer here. And that could even happen, you design your component, at one point it was slow, but now we did something in the servers, so this defer is actually no longer needed, but now you get it in a more efficient way.
There's an alternative mindset, which is that either it should always, like an exploding defer should actually, or like an inefficient defer should actually be an error, right? Where like the server starts deferring and then hits like the 500th item and just is like, I don't want to do this anymore, right? Like, this is potentially dangerous for me. I'm deferring all these things. Client, you've proposed a query that explodes on me, so here's the data, it exploded, like fix your query. Right.
I don't think we can do that because,
Yeah.
you know, GraphQL very much wants to have backwards compatibility with all the requests. And it could be that there wasn't enough data in the system to ever trigger this.
Exactly. I wanted to say that.
Wasn't even a schema change or a configuration change that caused this. It's just more data and suddenly it blows up. I don't think we can do that. It's an interesting idea though.
The problem is that is you have a very empty database in the beginning, and then everything works fine. You deploy it to production and it suddenly starts exploding.
Yeah, I mean, we do have lists where if the list grows too large, we'll basically either just like not give you more than not give you all the items in the list and just lie to you, or explode, be like, yeah, this component that was working 2 years ago, like that something on the server has changed, either more data has come in, like and now it's a problem that you need to fix server side, basically, because you've got this deployed 2-year-old thing. You have to like figure out which of those 200 items, like which 50 of them you actually care about.
So
Yeah.
I wanted to just comment on the previous discussion for a moment again. So I'm in favor of inlining and always have been. That's why my specs have always enabled that. But I do want to make sure that we are making that decision based on actual data from an implementation and not just based on our gut feel. Because my gut feel says we should forget about making the payloads predictable and we should instead trade towards the idea of inlining because it's more efficient. But what I would like to do is actually validate that that gut feel and make sure that actually, does it make that much effort for the server to actually not inline these things? Is it going to be that much of a cost in network, especially once gzipped? Because I suspect that the network cost is going to be minimal. I suspect that the server won't actually have to do a huge amount more work to do these things as deferred. I mean, all it's doing is just putting them in a later JSON payload rather than, or even in the same one in the pending block rather than straight away in line. So I don't think that that cost is particularly huge either. I don't think the cost of memory usage is going to go up by that much. So I'd really like to get some actual measurements and say like, oh no, actually, yeah, this definitely is a problem and we should definitely allow inlining versus, oh, we thought we should allow inlining, but actually, even if we don't inline, it's not actually that expensive.
Yeah, it's like the one thing we tried out is I'm not worried about the response size actually, but about the like in .NET we have a task scheduler. So every time we spawn these tasks, they become an overhead in the system and can at some point yield to a very bad server performance. And that is where we actually look at inlining. So to lower the branches that we do on the processing.
But you don't actually need to do that, right? You can inline the actual computation of it and then just write the data out in the payload into another location. So you don't need to add like a job to your task queue or anything like that to handle it.
No,
I mean, I don't know how your system works, but like,
yeah, no, that's correct. But if we have like branching in the algorithm, then we basically do that there, or we inline it, and then it's just in the resolver and it's done and is written to the response shape, right? Like, you know, like when you defer, you branch off this task suddenly. Now we have the actual resolver and our branched work. And usually we would inline that and just write it into the response shape.
okay, yeah, that's cool. In my system, the writing of the payload like to the response is completely separate from the calculation of the data. So I can do the calculation of it in line effectively, but then still write it out to a different location in the response without really any additional cost. Okay,
that's like these are two different rented objects. They live in, but this implementation detail. This implementation detail.
I'll also say that allowing inlining is a much less risky move for the spec. Like if we decide that it was a bad idea and that we really do want the consistent payloads, it's not a breaking change to remove that from the spec. And now like servers that follow the spec from whatever day going forward don't do inlining anymore. But if we start from day one that inlining is not allowed, we can't ever start to allow it because it would break clients that expect things to never be inlined.
That is a very good point and worth thinking about.
Yakov, your comment, what do you mean? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about, I actually forget how, whether Benji was talking about this specifically or more generally about the issue of inlining. But meaning if we have this, but basically the question is whether we should allow, if we do allow inlining, would we allow on a particular field for some of that was nested under a list, would we allow inlining on only some of those objects? So, you know, if it's streamed, then we've already deferred some of the fields that we've already sent. We can't, you know, we're basically forced into changing the response shape if we want to also have a hard limit on the number of defers, because we have to commit, you know, with the first couple items potentially, you know, whether we're going to defer or not, and we don't know yet whether we'll reach that theoretical hard limit. I think so meaning it, and that Benji was talking about the predictable response shape and how that might be desirable, not with respect to, you know, let's say we are going to allow inlining, so there's a certain branching there, but it's on a per field level. But here we're seeing an example where it's even on a per object level, and we're sort of forced into that by, it's like a tricky operation like this.
Yeah,
this
I think
case-
if you allow any inlining, then the predictable response shape, the predictable little payloads go out the window, whether you think of them as field level or object level. I was only ever thinking of them as object level. But yeah, I think that just goes out the window just by virtue of choosing to be able to inline anything.
Sounds good.
Okay, we're running out of time, so let's wrap up. Next steps, what do we need to do? If we're all okay with this this payload shape now, I think that Matt was like the only one that had concerns from the last time that we presented it. I guess we can start moving forward with this now. Yakov, you have your implementation. The PRs, I'll review the publisher one. I think that since we're okay with this payload, we can start getting this merged now. We'll start working on the spec. And I think probably the next meeting we should dedicate to what Benji brought up about early execution of deferred fields and talk through that next week. Any other next steps we need?
I wanted to ask for a small thing. I missed like half of this meeting, and other half I just listened without watching to slides or what people showed. Maybe if someone have access to this meeting, can you share a video in Discord group? And I will watch it asynchronously before it, because if I wait for you for it to be published on YouTube, it's like 1 month probably. So can you post?
Yeah, this is
video.
recorded by the GraphQL Foundation account. I don't think I have access to that. I'm not sure. Maybe Benji does.
Yeah, it's me. And uploading all the YouTube videos is on me as well. So what I would do is just upload this preferentially onto YouTube.
Oh, thank you, Benji.
But on that topic, Ivan, I actually sent you a direct message. We had you on the phone earlier. I think you didn't realize that you weren't muted. Does any of that need editing out, or is it okay?
Everything is okay. I had like renovation. I can show you. Like guys cut out with hole in my ceiling to make like a staircase. So I was talking to workers and I forgot to mute myself.
Okay, cool, good. That should make it easier for me to upload the video because I won't have to edit it.
No worries. No secret information there.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.